Welcome to lecture number 6, the second part of a case of settler colonialism. We have so far focused on the practical, the more material plans of the Zionist leadership in Palestine to further Jewish settlement. And particularly, we talked so far about how land was to be achieved to establish Jewish settlement. I would like to add also that this material activity on the ground was accompanied by ideological ideas and beliefs. In relation to land, Zionist ideologists believe that land that is purchased from Arab owners and made it into Jewish settlement is land that need to be redeemed. So, though Zionism was a secular project, not a religious one, there were some biblical undertones and ideological belief related to the history of the Jewish people in the land of Israel that were incorporated into the Zionist machine. Another important aspect of Jewish settlement in Palestine was labor. Labor had to be created for the waves of Jewish immigrations coming into Palestine. A particular idea emerged during the second Aliyah, the idea of Hebrew labor, or Avodah Ivrit in Hebrew, which referred to how the second Aliyah immigrants saw themselves conquering, achieving labor, and establishing themselves as workers in Palestine. The story of Avodah Ivrit, or Hebrew labor, refers to the developing relations between the first Aliyah Jewish landowners, those few hundred families that had achieved land and developed plantation colonies or moshavot, and the second Aliyah Jewish immigrants that were seeking jobs. We will see how the relations between these two groups evolved from a classical class conflict between landowners and landless people seeking jobs into a national conflict that became part and parcel of the Zionist struggle against the indigenous people in Palestine. Let us remind ourselves a few things about the first Aliyah to understand how a class conflict emerged with the second Aliyah immigrants. So the first Aliyah, the first wave of Jewish immigration from Eastern Europe, began even before the Zionist organization was established in Europe, even before the first Zionist congresses were convened by Herzl. Immigrants who came to Palestine during the early period were supported by the Baron de Rothschild and also by the JCA, the Jewish Colonization Association, that was originally established by another Jewish philanthropist, the Baron de Hirsch. The type of settlement that this immigrant established was called the ethnic plantation type, which means that land was owned by Jewish organizations and later by the Jewish families themselves. And in order to implement a type of cash crops agriculture, they hired people to work the land. They hired both Arab fellahin and also some of the first Aliyah Jewish workers that had no land. But at a certain point, these tracts of lands were transferred from Rothschild and from the colonization associations to the settler families themselves. And from this point onwards, they had to survive on their own. They have to find ways to make their colonies profitable, sustainable. At this point, they prefer to hire mainly Arab fellahin and not Jewish workers from the first Aliyah. And this is because the Arab fellahin, they ask for lower wages. In addition, they were much more experienced in working the land in Palestine than any of the workers from the first Aliyah. This situation aggravated when more Jewish immigrants came into the country with the second wave of immigration, the second Aliyah. Many could not find jobs in agriculture, working at the moshavot, at the plantation colonies. Some of them found employment in the towns, but as a result of the lack of work and the harsh conditions in Palestine, many of the Jewish immigrants in the second Aliyah will leave the country. From 1904, a new type of Jewish immigrant is coming into Palestine. This is the second Aliyah. The group of people that came during this period of time were different from the first Aliyah. The second Aliyah immigrants were very experienced in politics. They had taken part in local politics in their country of origin in Eastern Europe. There were many that were part of the revolutionary experience in Russia with the Communist Revolution, and they were very ideological in their Zionist beliefs. When these people came into Palestine, and as we said before, they were looking for jobs and tried to get hired by the first Aliyah landowners of the moshavot, the plantation colonies, they realized that the Jewish landowners from the first Aliyah preferred the Arab fellahin, both because they were cheaper and also because they were better agricultural workers. On their side, the Jewish workers from the second Aliyah looking for jobs, they demanded higher wages. To compete with the Arab workers, with the Arab fellahin, they tried to reduce their expectations, they tried to accept the level of wages that the Arab fellahin received, but eventually this strategy failed. They couldn't make a living as they understood it with that kind of level of wages, and still the first Aliyah landowners preferred the Arab fellahin. This situation was leading to a conflict between the first Aliyah landowners and those Jewish immigrants coming during the second Aliyah. In 1905, political groups among the second Aliyah decided to wage a sort of conflict against the first Aliyah landowners in order to force them, to push them to hire workers from the second Aliyah. And they called this kind of struggle Hebrew labor, Avodah Ivrit. The idea was that first Aliyah landowners must hire second Aliyah Jewish workers in order to give them work and the opportunity to stay in the country for the sake of the Zionist project of Jewish settlement. Without giving job to the second Aliyah workers, more and more people will be leaving Palestine and the whole Zionist project will be doomed to fail. So basically, what the second Aliyah workers with their Hebrew labor program were saying to the first Aliyah landowners was, hire us, the Jewish worker, don't hire the Arab fellahim. This obviously brought the situation according to which there is now a differentiation between Arab and Jewish workers in the labor market. So the labor market started to be split along national and racial lines. In order to help the first Aliyah landowners to hire the more expensive Jewish second Aliyah workers, agencies from the Zionist organization help with funds, sort of cushioning their wages. Also, there was an attempt to monopolize certain jobs in agriculture to be given only to Jewish workers, those jobs that were better paid because they require more qualified skill. Did the strategy of Hebrew labor, that is Jewish labor, or hire only us, succeed? Not. It did not. The labor market did become split at the skill level, that is, from this period onwards, in agriculture and also in other jobs, certain better paid jobs were given to Jewish workers at the expenses of Arab workers. But the tactic did not enable the standard of living that Jewish immigrants pursued in order to build their new society, a new culture, and new institutions. So the Zionists did not conquer the labor market. They failed to do so. In agriculture particularly, first Aliyah landowners kept hiring mainly Arab fellahim. This situation brought about high levels of emigration out from Palestine. Almost 90% of the second Aliyah immigrants left the country. And nevertheless, it was the second Aliyah, the one that left the most significant imprint on the relations between immigrant Jews and native Arabs. Even if the conquest of labor idea or the Hebrew labor idea did not succeed at the strategy of conquering labor from the hands of Arab workers, it did impact as a value in the method of Jewish settlement. Because for the first time in Palestine, an idea that was calling to differentiate between workers, Arabs and Jews, was introduced. And it was introduced by the Zionists. Let us remember that until the Zionist waves of immigration arrived, the relationship between Arabs and Jews in Ottoman times were quite harmonious. As you remember, we call that shared life. But the Zionists, in their quest to build new settlements, a new society, and acquire labor that will enable people to stay in the country, they adopted a strategy that had huge cultural impact on the relations between Arabs and Jews in Palestine. These were very difficult years for the Zionist project in Palestine. In fact, it was an impasse. People could not find jobs to stay in the country. As we mentioned, most of the second Aliyah immigrants were leaving the country, and there was not enough land in order to give to the Jewish immigrants to create new settlements. The failure of the conquest of labor strategy generated two different alternatives. One was about importing Jewish workers from Yemen, and the other was the invention of the kibbutz. The Yavni Eli mission was a project that the Zionist organization decided upon in 1911 to bring Jews from Yemen as low-cost workers to replace the Arab fellahin in agricultural work, a mission that the Eastern European Jews from the first and the second Aliyah did not succeed to achieve. So there was a clear racial mentality behind this project. The Zionist organization, in fact, the Ashkenazi leaders of the Zionist organization in Europe and the Ashkenazi leaders of the Palestine office in Jaffa, Palestine, thought that Yemeni Jews are sort of pre-modern people like the Arab fellahin, the Arab peasants working in Palestine. They believe that if they bring these Yemeni Jews to work in Palestine, in the moshavot, in the plantation colonies, they will be paid as less as the Arab fellahin, and since they are pre-modern people, they will not be demanding higher wages and will not be in need of much money in order to survive. As I said, there was a very clear racist sentiment behind this project, both in the sense how the Ashkenazi Jew conceive their brethren from Yemen and how they conceive the Arab fellahin in Palestine. Between 1911 and 1912, Zionist official under the name of Yavnieli was sent to Yemen to persuade Yemeni Jews to immigrate to Palestine. He managed to bring 1,400 Yemeni Jews into Palestine. These people were pushed to take up jobs in agriculture, in the Moshevot, but eventually this experiment failed. This was simply because the Yemeni Jews refused to work for low wages as the Arab Felahin, and they were neither submissive as the white Ashkenazi Jew expected them to be. In fact, these Yemeni Jews had very little experience also as agricultural workers. So the whole experiment, the whole project, in all its aspects, failed. These Yemeni Jews that were imported into Palestine by the Zionist organization did not take jobs from the hands of the Arab Felahin. But again, there was another kind of impact to this Yavnieli mission. The Ashkenazi Jews made very clear that in their eyes there is a sort of hierarchy, a separation of roles and privileges between Jews of different origins in the Zionist project. There are those who lead, and there are those workers who deserve to be paid better, but also there are those Jews from Oriental origin, from Arab origin, that are not considered as worthy as the Ashkenazi, neither to lead or to get higher wages as the Ashkenazi workers wanted. During the same period of time that the Zionist organization was looking for solutions to find land and labor for the Jewish immigrants of the second Aliyah, and the Yavnieli mission failed, and the attempt to downgrade wages failed, and the attempt to take up the jobs from Arab hands in agriculture failed, another solution was being considered. If the Jewish hire worker cannot compete against the Arab Felahin, so the solution that was being considered was to cancel altogether the very category of the Jewish hire worker. How? This found a solution via the invention of a new form of settlement, a cooperative agricultural settlement that was called kibbutz, which means congregation or even community. And this cooperative agricultural settlement, its most important characteristic was that in the kibbutz will be no hire labor. Gershon Shafir defined the kibbutz as based on pure settlement methodology. Let's see how it worked. A group of people that were recruited via the Palestine office were sent together on land bought by the JNF or other Zionist agency to live together as in a commune. So a form of cooperativism and sharing was assumed for this new type of settlement called the kvutza, which in Hebrew means literally the group or the collective. So the kvutza were a bunch of people living together and working together the land, and also having all other aspects of social life shared. Already in 1907, the 8th Zionist Congress decided that the JNF will buy land to establish new kvutzot, which is the plural of kvutza. The kvutza became the kibbutz. The organization of the kvutza was more based on personal relationships, whereas the kibbutz was conceived as a common project for the people living on the land. So, what is the kibbutz? The kibbutz, it's quite a homogeneous body of people, all Ashkenazi from Eastern European origins. This means that the kibbutzim, which is plural for kibbutz, were never willing to accept Sephardic or Maghrebi Jews to be part of the kibbutz. In the kibbutz, people live in shared housing. They started to educate their children together in a form of Platonic fantasy, and they worked together the land. The land itself belonged to the JNF, but as you probably remember, land bought by the JNF can only be leased to Jewish people. When one compares the kibbutz form of settlement with the first aliyah moshava, or the plantation colony, we understand that the kibbutz provided a much better solution for settlement. This is because in the first aliyah plantation colony type, you have just a family owning tracts of land and hiring mainly Arab fellahin to work the land. The plantation colony of the first aliyah did not provide space to absorb immigrants in the sense of housing, and in neither these people were willing to hire Jewish workers. So it didn't provide a solution also in terms of labor for the Jewish immigrants, also from the first and the second aliyah. But the kibbutz, in contrast, on tracts of land, it provided a solution for a large number of people, of families, who lived together in a communal style based on cooperativism. The kibbutz did not hire people to work the land because the people living in the kibbutz, they were the kibbutz. So the kibbutz created a method to bypass the problem of competition against the Arab fellahin in the labor market. The kibbutz provided land to settle, housing, work, and all other aspects of social and cultural life that slowly began to be developed within the confines of each kibbutz. So the kibbutz was also a method to protect the Jewish immigrant workers from the labor market itself. It sort of created extraterritorial spaces within Palestine where only Jewish immigrants could settle, find a place to live and labor. The first kibbutz was established in 1910 close to the Lake Tiberias and was called Degania. Eventually, the kibbutz provided the very infrastructure of effective Jewish colonization and the nucleus, both ideological and material, for the future Jewish state. If you think about, you can see that the kibbutz was a model of settlement because it could offer a homogeneous system in which Jewish people only could have land, housing, labor, and socio-cultural life. At this stage, we can identify about 4 stages of Zionist activity in Palestine. So we began first with the first Aliyah and the creation of a small-holding farmer stratum that was supported mainly by Jewish philanthropists. These colonies or plantations rely on unskilled seasonal Arab labor, and there were also a small Jewish labor force employed in these colonies or moshavot. At the second stage, with the second Aliyah, we identify failed attempts to lower their standard of living and wages in order to compete with the Arab fellaheen. This is, as said, a failed attempt, and the national dimension is intensified because the second Aliyah workers are soon going to demand from the first Aliyah landowners to employ only Jewish workers. This is in fact already the third stage, starting in 1905 with the program of conquest of labor or Hebrew labor, which was basically an aspiration to monopolize all manual labor, particularly in agriculture, by Jewish workers. When this again fails, the Zionist organization tried to import Yemeni Jews in order to replace the Arab fellaheen, but also this project failed. In the fourth stage, we move from the attempt to conquer labor to creating an autonomous sphere of labor within the kibbutz. The JNF is commissioned to buy land and establish on these lands kibbutzim. This was a cooperative form of settlement that enabled land, housing, labor, and social life, or as Shafir identified it, the pure settlement methodology. The main point here is that Jewish exclusivism became the most significant imprint of the Zionist project in Palestine. Let us try and put together some conclusions when we look at the consequences of the different experimentations and policies implemented by the Zionist organization and the settlers themselves on the ground across the first and the second Aliyot. What was, in other words, the Zionist method of state and nation formation? Basically, Zionism was carving in Palestine a separated domain of life to base Jewish autonomous life, separated, protected, segregated from everything that was native life in Palestine. This means that the form of shared life of Arabs and Jews during Ottoman times until Zionist immigration was being challenged, but this self-segregated form of Jewish life in the new issue. This also meant that a new economy, a Jewish-only economy, was being created by way of establishing the kibbutzim, which will be incorporated in economic production, and by way of trying to conquer labor only for Jewish workers. So altogether, Zionism was using a separatist and exclusivist method of colonization through which a new space of life, separated, self-segregated for native Palestinian life, was being carved and created. By 1914, the Yishuv comprises about 80,000 people, approximately 10% of Palestine population. The Yishuv is already becoming a mini-state under the Ottoman Empire. Settlement was being designed and implemented as only for Jewish immigrants, both in rural and urban areas where new neighborhoods were being built in Haifa, and also soon the city of Tel Aviv will be established, separated from the Arab city of Jaffa, all under the pattern established by Arthur Rupping of the N shape of settlement. This new issue was basing itself economically separated from the economy in Palestine. The issue was also creating a separated educational system based on Hebrew language and Hebrew culture, and also in the realm of security, the Yishuv was building its own security force. In 1907, an armed group called Bar Gira was established. Its goal was to replace the Arab guards that were guarding the colonies, the moshavot of the first Aliyah landowners. 2 years after, the Bar Gira group was replaced by the Ashomer paramilitary organization, which its main aim was to protect the colonists, and also Ashomer paramilitary groups were sent wherever land was purchased by the JNF. So it was first taken up by the Ashomer guards until the land was handed over the Jewish settlers. Later, the Ashomer will turn into the Agana in 1920, which was already a nationwide underground defense organization. The Agana will become the actual IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, in 1948. So as you see, the new issue during the first and the second Aliyah was gradually turning into a separated realm, something becoming like a mini state for Jewish immigrants. And as the Zionist issue was being consolidated as a self-segregated entity, there are two more topics to discuss that we haven't yet covered. One is the nature of Ashkenazi Sephardi relations, and the other is obviously the nature of Arab-Palestinian resistance. Remember that until the first Aliyah, the majority of the Jewish community in Palestine were Sephardim, Mizrahim, Maghrebim, all of them Jews from Oriental descent or Oriental Jews, with small minority of Ashkenazi Orthodox religious, ultra-Orthodox Jews living mainly in the holy cities in Palestine. So from the moment that the first Aliyah began, Ashkenazi Jews from Eastern Europe started to arrive to Palestine, and the balance, the ethnic balance between Oriental Jews and Ashkenazi Jews started to change. By the second Aliyah, we have quite a big number of Ashkenazi Jews among the Jewish community in Palestine, making an impact with their new issue, the new form of settlement segregated from the natives of Palestine, both Arabs and Jews. Now, so the question is now, what were the relations between the Ashkenazi Zionists coming from Eastern Europe during the first and the second Aliyot and the Oriental Jews of Palestine, or how they perceived each other? First, let us look into how the Zionist movement perceived the Oriental Jews of Palestine. And to illustrate this, I will quote two significant figures during this period. One we already met, Arthur Rupin. He was the head of the Palestine office that opened in Jaffa in 1908. Rupin belonged to what can be described as mainstream Zionism or labor Zionism. And then I will quote from a person on the right-wing Zionism. So Arthur Rupin, in 1908, the very same year that he started to function as the head of the Palestine office in Jaffa, he delivered a speech to a group of Viennese Jews, and in which he described the composition of the Jewish population in Palestine. So the quote said, "The first is made up of those Sephardic Jews who have lived in the country for centuries, have become closely assimilated in mores and in their general mode of life to the local Arabs, and who, side by side with Ladino, speak Arabic too. They receive no halukah money, earn a difficult and pitiful living as small merchants and artisans, are poorly educated and of not a particular high moral standing. The Jews of Morocco, Persia, and the Yemen, who have come into Palestine in recent years, may be lumped together with this group." Now, a couple of clarifications before we discuss this quote. First of all, Rupin is describing the Sephardic Jew that lived in the country for centuries. We know that. We discussed a couple of weeks ago the events of the Spaniard and the Portuguese Inquisition in late 15th century, when the Jews in the Iberian Peninsula are expelled, and eventually they settle in the Ottoman Empire, some of them also in Palestine. So we know that fact, that the Sephardic Jews were living in Palestine for a while. We know also that they spoke Arabic and Ladino, but they also spoke other languages. The Chaluka or Haluka money was money that was fundraised in Europe and in the United States, and was money sent to Palestine mainly to be given to the Ashkenazi Orthodox religious Jews. They didn't work, most of them, so they lived out of charity. But the Sephardic Jews received no Haluka money, so they actually work and earn their living. Rupin says that these people are poorly educated and of a not particularly high moral standing. As you can see, Rupin perceived the Oriental Jews in a very negative way. He clearly makes here a sort of hierarchy between himself and the Ashkenazi Jews coming from Europe, and all those other Jews with an Oriental Arab background. He also mentioned in this quote that the Sephardic Jew became assimilated to the Arabs, to the local Arabs. And he obviously described this in a very negative fashion. But we know that this fact is what explains in great way that the Sephardic Jews and the other Oriental Jews lived quite in harmony with the Arabs of Palestine, and also with other Arab people across the Ottoman Empire. So this is how Arthur Rupin saw the Oriental Jews in Palestine, not in any way positively. And let us now move into how another important person of the Zionist movement in this period, but sitting on the right wing of Zionism, perceived the Oriental Jews. The person I'm talking about now is Ze'ev Jabotinsky. Jabotinsky left mainstream Zionism in 1923, and he found a new movement, the revisionist movement, which was right-leaning. It was a national movement. They have major territorial aspirations for the future Jewish state. So just to compare, if the mainstream labor Zionism, their territorial aspirations were between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, all those territories to be gradually conquered. On the other hand, the revisionist movement believed that also what is nowadays Jordan and even parts of Syria should be a part of their future Jewish state. So they were much more, they had made major aspirations from a territorial point of view, and they were very nationalist. Now, from the revisionist movement, eventually during the years, a new political party will be established. This is the Likud party, the party that nowadays is governing Israel, and that the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is its leader. Now, back to Jabotinsky and how he perceived the Oriental Jews. In 1926, he wrote, "Thank God we, the Jews, have nothing in common with the Orient. To the extent that our uneducated masses have legal and spiritual ancient traditions that are reminiscent of the Orient, we must win them away from them. This is precisely what every decent school does. and this is how life is dealt with diligently and successfully. We came to the land of Israel, firstly, for our national comfort, and secondly, as Nordo said, to expand the frontiers of Europe to the Euphrates River. In other words, we are here in order to sweep away from the land of Israel thoroughly, as far as Judaism is concerned, in the present and in the future, all traces of the Oriental soul. And as far as the Arabs of the land of Israel are concerned, it is their business. But if we can do them a favor, then this is the only one, to help also them to free themselves from the Orient. Well, as you see, this position is much more straightforward. He is talking about what we call deracination, which means to clean up certain racial traits from a people. Here, Jabotinsky is talking about cleaning from the Jewish soul the Orient, and is referring obviously to the Oriental Jews, to the Maghrebim, the Mizrahim, and the Sephardim. He believes that the Ashkenazi Jews representing Europe are the standard, and all other Jews must conform with this. He's also talking about the role of Europe in the Zionist enterprise. So as you see, there is a strong connection here between the values and beliefs that Zionism is based on, and those that Europe itself was based on. He's also referring here in this quote to the Arabs of Palestine themselves, and saying that, well, it is their business, but if we should do them a favor, the favor should be to also clean them up from the Orient. As you see, both Jabotinsky and Rupin held racist views towards the Arabs in general, and also towards the Arab Jews, that is, towards the Oriental Jews. Let us see now what was the position of the Sephardim themselves toward those Jewish Zionist immigrants and towards the Zionist movement more in general. I'm focusing here on the Sephardic community because they were the most significant part, we can say, of the old Yishuv in Palestine. They were also their representatives in the Millet Ottoman system, the representatives of the Jewish community. So among the Sephardim, there were two positions. Hard to say which one was the most prevalent until World War I. After World War I, things are going to change, but until then, there were two positions. One was a pro-Zionist position, and another was a critique of Zionism. Now, the pro-Zionist Sephardim, they were in favor of something that can be called inclusive Zionism. So they did accept the idea that Judaism must be renewed, culturally speaking, society-wise, but they still believe that this can be done by sharing Palestine, sharing the homeland as they saw it, with the Arabs. So they understood Zionism as a sort of cultural Hebraism and not a territorial enterprise. They didn't like the idea that Zionism should lead to a separated Jewish state, and they tried to bridge between the Ashkenazi Zionists coming from Eastern Europe that held a very negative attitude towards the Arabs of Palestine, and the Arabs themselves on the other hand. These attempts and failed. In the long run, we can say that these attempts failed simply because the Ashkenazi Zionists coming from Europe were not interested in extending any bridge and in sharing with the Arabs of Palestine the land. They also try very hard to encourage the Ashkenazi Zionists immigrating into Palestine to learn Arabic. We need to remember that Arabic was the dominant language in the country. Both Arabs and Oriental Jews spoke the language. So in their eyes, it was only logical and made sense that the new immigrants coming from Europe should learn Arabic. But the Zionists refused to learn Arabic. In their eyes, learning Arabic will be assimilating, and they prefer to develop a society, what we call the new Yishuv, based on Hebrew as the dominant language and separated from the native society. So that was the pro-Zionist Sephardim position. On the other hand, there were those Sephardim that were very critical of Zionism, and they opposed the policies that the Zionists were adopting during the first and the second Aliyot. So, for instance, they opposed the displacement of the Felahin from the land that was purchased by the Zionist agencies such as the JNF, the Jewish National Fund. They believed that the Felahin should remain on the land and allow them to continue working and make their living. This position also rejected the idea of Hebrew labor, that is, that work need to be conquered from Arab workers in order to give work to the Jewish European immigrants. And they obviously rejected the idea of a separated Jewish society. So as you can see, both positions of the Sephardim, even those who were sympathetic of the Zionist ideas and those that were critical, did not share with Zionism the idea that a new separated Jewish society should be established. Those attempts by the Sephardim to bridge, to teach Arabic to the Jewish Europeans were seen in the eyes of the Zionists as acts of betrayal, and they were even were called Arab patriots, simply because they refused to accept Zionism in all their axioms. As you can see, we can already sense here a fracture being built between the Ashkenazi Zionists coming from Eastern Europe and those Oriental Jews living in Palestine, or if you like, between the new Yishuv and the old Yishuv. This fracture will deepen with the time, and we will see next week how things unfold in the context, in the more general context of the conflict with the Arab natives. And this is exactly the point that we turn now to have a look. This is the aspect missing in today's lecture, Arab resistance. How the Arabs of Palestine, Muslim and Christian Arabs, reacted to this Zionist project. How they reacted to the first Aliyah, how they reacted to the second Aliyah. So we will end today's lecture with a discussion on Arab resistance. Let us be clear about this. Arab resistance to the Zionist settlement project began with the first steps of Zionist settler colonization. That is, from the very first years of the first Aliyah, when the Felahin and people owning tracts of land started to realize the real goals of the Zionist movement, violent incidents appear. These incidents, already the first of them took place 2 years after what we call the beginning of the first Aliyah, that is in 1884 in Gedera, and then we have another incident a couple of years after in Petah Tikva and Rehovot, but small incidents between Arab Felahin and the new owners of the land, the Jewish immigrants that are settling on land bought by Zionist agencies. These incidents are emerging from the very first moments. In the weekly reading by Rashid Khalidi, a Palestinian scholar from Columbia University, you will find there the following quote. Khalidi says, "The Felahin naturally considered the land to be theirs and often discover that they had ceased to be the legal owners only when the land was sold to Jewish settlers by an absentee landlord who has acquired it in the decades following the implementation of the 1858 land law." Let us explain this a bit. As you remember, the Ottomans legislated the land code in 1858, according to which they aim at pushing Arabs in the empire to register the land on their name. There were many cases in which small peasants holding small tracts of land prefer to register the land on the name of some Ayan, some Arab elite person from the cities, because the Felahin families did not want or could not pay taxes that will derive from the new law. And also, once you register land on your name, you need to serve in the army. So the Felahin families, which live with quite very modest, very modest style of life, they prefer not to register the land on their name. There were other cases as well in which there were debts, and the debts were paid by registering the land on the name of some rich person from the city, a major landowner. Many of these people, of these rich landowners, did not live in Palestine even. So the situation was that the Felahin continued to live on the land that they used to own in the past, and they pay a rent to the new rich landowner. And when these rich landowners sold tracts of their land to the Zionist agencies, the Zionist agencies displaced the Felahin on the land, and the Felahin themselves did not understood what was going on, because in their own eyes they continued to be the practical owners of the land, because they worked the land and they lived from the land. So you can imagine that this is the reason why the Felahin were in fact the first to react to Zionist colonization, because they were the first that were affected by purchasing of land by the Zionist agencies. Now, during the first Aliyah, there were cases that the Felahin were allowed to lease back some of their land, and they pay a rent to the Zionist agencies that bought the land. Or in other cases, they were employed by the Moshevot, the plantation colonies, and were allowed to continue to live on the land. But this arrangement ceased during the second Aliyah. The second aliyah was much more aggressive in this sense, and land that was purchased by the Zionist agencies, particularly by the JNF, people living on the land, the Fellahin living on the land, were displaced and they were not offered any form of employment. So again, you can understand why the Fellahin were the first segment of the Arab population in Palestine to feel the Zionist colonization impact and react to that. And this is why they were engaged in a series of violent incidents with the new settlers. So far, I describe Fellahin or rural resistance, and now I would like to turn to what was taking place in the cities in Palestine. A turning point took place in 1908 with the Young Turks Revolution that we discussed a couple of weeks ago. Let me remind you that in the Young Turks Revolution, the first steps were very encouraging from the viewpoint of the citizens of the empire, in the sense that certain measures of democratizations were adopted. The Ottoman constitution was restored, and the parliament was reopened after it was suspended by the Sultan Abdul Hamid II in 1878. And there was a call for elections for the parliament, and also the Young Turk revolutions opened the press, so a new era of freedom of press began. Now, in the parliament, in the Ottoman parliament, there were a number of representatives of the Arab Palestinian community. A significant representative was Rui al-Khalidi, that was elected to represent the District of Jerusalem. He was a very well-known critic of Zionism, and he demanded in parliament restricting Jewish immigration and selling land to the Jewish Zionist organization. These were two demands we will see in the weeks to come that will appear again and again every time that we discuss Palestinian resistance and Palestinian demands from the imperial government. So we had a certain level of anti-Zionist activity in the Ottoman parliament, and also because of the freedom of the press that began with the Young Turk Revolution, we witnessed in this period of time an explosion of new newspapers in Palestine and all over the empire, in fact, in a number of languages. Many articles, hundreds of articles were published every year criticizing Zionist settlement. There were two main Arab newspapers that led the resistance and the attack on the Zionist settlement. These two newspapers were Filastin, that operated from Jaffa, and Al-Karmil, that operated from Haifa. I would like to go through a number of themes or topics that began to stand at the nucleus of the Palestinian demands, the Palestinian discourse against Zionist settlement, and that will eventually be a major part of what can be called the emergent Arab-Palestinian national consciousness. So these themes stood at the center of the emerging and forming national agenda of the Palestinians during this period of time. So first of all, the Arab Palestinians were very critical of the Ottoman government because of the the very relaxed attitude towards Zionist colonization. They specifically opposed Zionist immigration. They demanded a better, a more restricted system of immigration for the to stop the immigration of Eastern European Jews into Palestine, and also they demanded to restrict land purchase by the Zionist agencies. They already sensed that this incremental movement of purchasing land and expelling the Fellaheen from the land was a sign of what was about to happen in the future, in the sense of a Zionist takeover of the country. Arab Palestinians resented the fact that these Jewish immigrants coming from Eastern Europe self-segregated themselves instead of trying to merge with the native society. And when you put all together, there were people that already fear that Zionism will eventually put the Arabs as a minority in their own country. One more point I'd like to mention is that during this period of time where there was existed a political space opened by the Young Turks Revolution, which will very soon close, because the Young Turks Revolution turned to become a more Turkish nationalist project rather than a democratization of the empire, and also because of World War I that is approaching. So the last point I wanted to mention is that during this time, many Arab societies, what we will call nowadays NGOs, but also political parties, were established, and these organizations were mainly engaged in anti-Zionist resistance. Reading from Rashid Halidi's book, I believe we can identify a sort of three stages in the development of Arab Palestinian resistance to the Zionist project, which will become, this is very important to mention, these stages, these processes will become part of the emerging national identity of the Arabs of Palestine. So in the first stage, as we mentioned before, we identified mainly rural and Fellaheen resistance and opposition to Zionist land purchases and to evictions. There were violent incidents between the Fellaheen and the new settlers, as we mentioned, and also Fellaheen petitioned many times the Sultan. There is nowadays literature on this topic. There were many attempts to write to the Sultan and ask for his help in facing Zionist takeover of the land. At a second stage, the influential Arab Palestinian families, mainly those from Jerusalem as the Halidis and the Husseinis, tried to raise issues related to Jewish immigration and Zionist land purchasing with the local Ottoman authorities in Palestine, trying to tell them that this is unacceptable, that they should do more in order to restrict both Jewish immigration and land purchasing. At the third stage, we identified the Young Turk Revolution as a turning point through which a political space is opened that allows from quite a lot of activity in the press, to write and publish about the Zionist settlement and how the Arabs reacted to it. Also, there is political activity in the Ottoman Parliament, and these all together bring us to a more concerted resistance, both coming from the ground, from the Arab Felahin, and also from the cities. I would like to conclude this lecture today by echoing Rashid Halidi's words and understanding that wherever the resistance that was shaped from the urban elites, the urban elites, both from the rich families from Jerusalem and also from the other cities like Jaffa and Haifa, this opposition to Zionism was shaped and was influenced by the cumulative effects of the Felahin experience with the Zionist land agencies. So it is very important to keep this in mind. The first reaction to the Zionist project comes from the Felahin themselves, those people that are suffering the impact of this new colonizing movement, and only at a later stage the people from the cities join the struggle by means of trying to use their influence with local government and officials, and also trying to create a new public opinion around the issue through by using the press, and also by forming new Arab societies and new Arab political parties. At this point, we are now ready to continue to watch the movie Seeds of Conflict. I'm asking you now to watch from minute 22. From that minute on until the end of the movie tells about the second Aliyah and how the national conflict and the native settler conflict, these two aspects of the encounter between the Zionist movement and the native of Palestine, unfolded towards World War I.